This is From Poop to Glimmer, Navigating the Literary Magazines Without Such a Well-Connected Guide. My name is UV Zalko. I'm too cowardly to do this in person, so I pre-recorded it with the hopes that they'll still let me graduate doing it this way. This is going to cover my experience getting published in literary magazines, both with my short stories and essays. I was doing particularly heavy submitting for about 4 years until about a year ago, mostly going by way of the slush piles. I'm not trying to say that I know some effective method. I'm sure many people here will have much better methods with more impressive skills and successes. I should also say that this will not cover writing a novel, finding an agent, publishing a book, how to be a smart networker, how to deal with constipation, or anything else of value. It is more just my kind of personal experience running through this. So mostly, this whole writing thing is about the writing. But at some point, once you get a couple stories that you feel are in pretty good shape, you'll want to get them out in the world. In my case, I started about 5 years ago when I had 4 or 5 or 6 stories that I thought suck less than some of my other stories. And I was trying to figure out where to begin. Part of it is who you know. In my case, I didn't have any connections, or at least the connections I had I was too stupid to use. So it took more effort. I found it was important to come up with some kind of rough idea of how to balance the submitting part of the writing life with the writing part. In my case, 90-10 did the trick. 90% writing, 10% submitting. This is roughly, I didn't really count the minutes, but I just felt like a vast majority needed to be about learning how to write better, but I never wanted to lose track of the submitting process. You might find that something else might work for you better, 80-20, 93.5, whatever. It was important for me to have a goal. I wanted some kind of plan that was realistic to who I was. Here's my plan at a high level. I was going to submit my stories or essays to at least 10 places a month. I started out trying to get published anywhere. I didn't consider anything too lowbrow for submission purposes. I let myself submit to places like the New Yorker or Harper's, but I treated those kind of submissions like buying lottery tickets, and I made sure I spent most of my time shooting for publications that were more realistically in my realm. My plan was to get more selective and snooty about where I was submitting after I got a few publications under my belt, but I would kind of build to that. And even if I wasn't selective with regard to how reputable the magazine was, I still spent time trying to find the right publication for each piece of writing. I made sure to get at least one copy of each magazine that I was targeting. In the online world, it's obviously easier to do this kind of research, and that might be a smarter place to start. Duotrope's Digest is a fabulous website that I used frequently for finding magazines, and I'll talk about that website later. While studying these magazines, it was important for me not to get too lost doing this research. You could spend forever looking through literary magazines, and I did enough investigation to make sure I wasn't, for instance, sending my story about masturbation to a parenting magazine, but I tried to get back to my own writing as soon as possible once I checked the magazine I was targeting out. Now to switch over to submission letters or query letters. I tried to keep my submission letters really short and simple, especially when I first got started and didn't have much in the way of publications to show off about or anything else. I admit I broke down a few times and tried to talk about what a fool I was in the letter itself, but this didn't typically work. Even when I submitted stories that were thinly veiled autobiographical stories of what a fool I was, still trying to get that humor into the submission letter was not effective. I did try to say something particular to the magazine or editor if I could. If I liked a particular story or I liked an author they had recently published, and I definitely tried to address the letter to the editor, which you can usually do. I'll talk more about submission letters later. I'll have a few examples of an early one and a later one. Okay, so what were the results of this kind of half-assed but somewhat obsessive 5-year experience of submitting? I got 17 stories published, nine stories were contest finalists. To give you a quick rundown of some of the stories that were published. Published one about a girl I had the hots for who was vomiting in a toilet, one about my brother's colon, or really about my brother's lack of a colon and the related shitting problems, one about me losing my job, one about a sidewalk beside a building and a man smashing into that sidewalk, another one about being obsessed with a girl, another one about being obsessed with a girl, one about my obsession with Dance Dance Revolution, one about aliens taking over Uranus, one about a therapist, another one about being obsessed with a girl, one about God, and a bus. And so here's the basic rundown of my successes during that period of trying really hard to get published. Okay, so after coming off like an arrogant schmuck with that silly list, I want to get to the other part, which is really the main part of this whole thing, is how many rejections it took to get to this, what was mostly one pretty successful year of just getting to some decent literary magazines. 544 rejections. Not that I'm super obsessed with statistics, but in the earlier days of submitting, this was roughly a 32-to-1 rejection ratio. At one point, I got 80 rejections in a row. If you take my story, When My Body Smashed into the Sidewalk, it was rejected 25 times, and then it was published in Carve magazine and nominated for the Million Writers Award, which I now forget what that is. Okay, if you take one of my stories called Blue, it was rejected 22 times before Narrative magazine picked it up. It won second place in their love story contest. It won Wordstock short story competition, and chosen as one of the 50 best online short stories in 2009 by a place called Fig Leaf. So now let me talk a little bit about Glimmer Train. I wanted to get published in this magazine from the start of my short story writing life. Maybe even 10 years ago. I've been rejected by them 24 times. I sent them quite a few stories that I probably shouldn't have sent them, and I think I was lucky that they didn't just kind of get fed up with me and stop reading my stuff. But they did eventually publish my story, God and Buses. So exploring that particular story, that one got started when an editor of a book coming out called Portland Noir asked me to write a story about Portland for the book. A friend of a friend of a friend told this dude to contact me. So I guess it was a form of kind of lazy ass networking on my part. But so I wrote a story, and he really didn't like it. One of the things he said in his email was, it didn't add up to anything interesting. But I liked the story. I honestly felt I had taken it where I wanted it to go. And what he said didn't make me rethink what I had done. I still felt like it was a completed story. So I sent it unchanged to Glimmer Train, and they liked it. One thing they said in their letter was, we've enjoyed watching your work develop over these last few years. I'd gotten some better and better rejections from them over the years. The rejections were all short, but little words of encouragement that they just said, please submit again, or we like the story, but we're not accepting it. And so I made sure to keep sending them material whenever I had material good enough to send them, and eventually it paid off. So now, if you go back 4 years to when I had very few acceptance letters, there was the poop report. I had written a story about my brother's digestion issues, and somehow, for some reason, someone told me about a website totally dedicated to poop-related matters. So I sent them my story. And when they accepted my story, this was back in 2006, the editor warned me that this wasn't exactly their typical story, and that I should be prepared for a wide range of feedback. The first comment was by C. Everett Poop. He said, the story blows. The next dude agreed with C. Everett and said that my story was lacking in poetry, though he did admit that it had potential. Rectal Badger was kinder to my story and thought it was a good read. Anyway, I don't really have a point in sharing these comments. It's just that you don't often have the opportunity to get feedback from someone named Rectal Badger. So going back to non-poop related matters, just to give you an idea of how much submitting and rejecting I had done during this period, here's another look at it. I'm just going to show you an excerpt from my submission log. Just the lines in bold were the ones that got published, so you're pretty much looking at a shitload of rejections. And I gotta stop talking about poop and shit in this lecture. The thing I kept trying to convince myself of was to never give up on the process, whatever convoluted process I made up for myself, but also not to take it more seriously than the thing needs to be taken. The numbers did get better. This, I think, was because I was getting smarter at the submission process, but probably more important, I was honing the writing craft a little bit more. And I was sending out better stories to more targeted magazines. I think I mentioned earlier that it started out where I was getting about 32 rejections for every one acceptance, but then it got more like 6 to 1 at this point after doing this for 3 or 4 years very seriously. So here's my plan in more detail. I had a couple flavors of query letters ready to go. I wanted to get that base query letter down so that I could just tweak it slightly for particular publications. It sounds like a trivial thing, but for me the step was a real headache, or not having this step done was a real headache. So making this a kind of easy to repeat and brainless step helped me a lot. Similarly, I made sure that all my office supplies were ready to go. Stamps, all the right envelopes, labels, paper clips. This seems silly to talk about, but it was another thing that could stop me from getting stuff out there. Okay, so now on to slightly more essential things. I had a elaborate spreadsheet for prioritizing and organizing the submission process. This was good for me to get a big picture of things. I'll go into more detail about this spreadsheet after this presentation, but to quickly sum up, each column contained a short story, and it's ordered from the story I was most confident in to the story I was least confident in. The rows contained magazines, and it was ordered from the most reputable magazine all the way down to the poop report. I also kept a text document that kept a log of everywhere I submitted. This was useful for tracking when and where I submitted each piece to each place. There's obviously some duplication regarding these two forms, but still these are pretty lightweight documents. It takes about 20 seconds to get a submission into both of these documents, and I'll talk more about each of these later. With all these little submission rituals, it's possible to get too lost in the process, and so I had to keep reminding myself to keep the actual writing. That always took priority. It's pointless to submit if you're not trying to improve your writing at the same time. To give you an idea of a typical schedule for me, at least before I had a pooping infant in my household, here's an example. I'd read a little bit up front. Sometimes this was good to get myself warmed up. I'd read a short story that I really enjoyed, maybe for a half hour. Then I'd write for a chunk of time. For me, 2 hours was a good writing session. I'm not one of those people that can write for 8 hours straight, so a 2-hour session was pretty good. Then I'd let myself submit for an hour, spend time just getting it out, maybe to 3 places or something like that. I'd have some kind of goal. And then I'd get back maybe into a little reading, and then back to the writing. Okay, so now to change gears a little, here are some of the things I learned along the way. This is basically going to be a big mishmash of shit. Probably stuff you already know, probably obvious. But this is me pre-recorded, so you can't stop me. One thing I learned is that you need a certain kind of dedication, maybe more accurately, just an insane kind of dedication to both the writing practice and the submission practice. Also, I found it was important to keep a schedule that really works for who you are. I got tired of all this advice that you're not a writer if you don't write every day for some number of hours at some part of the day, wearing a hat or a certain kind of underwear. I think it's key that you find a schedule that suits your personality. For me, I'm not a write every day kind of writer, but I have some key slots every week where I write. I also felt like it was important to have a plan both for the short term, like what I'm up to in the next week or two, and also in the longer term, like over the next few months. But still, this wasn't anything too fancy. I just kind of had a rough path that I laid out for myself. This is another area where it can be tempting to get too bogged down in overscheduling and overplanning. But I think it's important to have some minimal amount of it done so you don't spend 25 years working on a novel that doesn't go anywhere. Another thing I found, which is pretty obvious, I guess, is that connections help. When I did get to know an editor, it helped. But you can't save a shitty story just because you know someone, and connections aren't required anyway. They make the process more efficient, but you can still stubbornly make your way through the slush pile in many decent magazines. Not necessarily the New Yorker, but in Glimmer Train, for example. So here's another thing I learned. Some stories just aren't good enough. I found that my heart just wasn't into some of the stories I started writing, and it was important for me to just dump those stories. On the other hand, I think editing and revising is critical, and most stories are worth working on through this process. The stories that I loved, even if they were a complete mess, I worked with through a second and third and fourth and fifth and sixth revision. Most of the stories I wrote that were successful were pretty messy on a first draft. Some of them came together very nicely on a second. Sometimes it took 3 or 4 drafts. I think it's just important to step back every now and then and assess what you're up to and what's important to focus on. Another way of thinking about this is fix what's broken, but focus your efforts on the most important projects. I have a limited amount of time to fuck around, and so I wanted to fuck around somewhat efficiently. Also, something I kept telling myself is there's always more to learn, and I tried to never let myself think that I knew what the hell I was doing. I also continually tried to study the greats, and I tried to study them repeatedly. I particularly obsessed over a couple short stories, and I read and reread them over and over again. I'm a slow reader, and I think I'm a pretty dumb reader, and I'm not so well read. But when I find a story that I love, I'll study the hell out of it. There was a particular story by Tobias Wolff called The Liar, and I was fascinated by how he messed around with point of view in that story, and so I read it and read it and read it and read it. Also, I think some books on writing are worth reading over and over again. Recently I read How Fiction Works by James Wood, and it had a section on narration that I thought was fascinating, and I studied that section carefully. But overdoing this whole reading craft books is a bit dangerous, at least it was for me. It began to blur the hell out of my writing. Too many conflicting voices in my head. I got lost, and it paralyzed the writing for me for a time. I also didn't take to books on writing that spoke about too many inflexible rules. But then again, maybe some inflexible rules are fine, as long as it speaks to you and what you're struggling with. A lot of decisions, I think along the way, you'll have to make that are based on gut instinct and understanding who you are and what you need. I also found that, similar to reading too many books on writing, listening to too many people can be a problem. This can happen if you try to take in everybody's feedback in a workshop, or listening to too many editors who don't like your work. Just to have so many of those voices in your head. But I think it's critical to find those people you do need to listen to, and to listen to them carefully. And through all of this, it's essential to never lose track of the writing and your own writing practice. So that's my intro. Now we can go into whatever you want in more detail.